without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ross Calloway.
Thank you. Well, it's a great day to give this presentation. Unfortunately, I think we do have a reasonable idea about what the outcome of the vote will be tonight, taking place at 8 o'clock your time, 7 o'clock our time. If you read the Financial Times, they've done a really careful analysis of the different options and outcomes, and they think that the best outcome is that Mrs May's withdrawal agreement will be defeated by about 100 votes. That's a very big defeat. It could be more than that. I mean, there are some analyses which say it could be defeated by 200 votes, and that would be a sort of epic defeat for any sitting Prime Minister and their inability to deliver legislation. So what I'm going to talk about is the Brexit timeline, which for many talks that I'd given over the last 2 years looked relatively straightforward, that this would be the 29th of March 2018, but there's now a big fat question over whether it will be the 29th of March 2018. And I will make a few tentative predictions, and they are my personal opinions about what's going to happen on the timeline. Why is it proving so difficult to get this deal through? And I'm not going to say a lot about it because this is a short presentation, but I will explain the key objections that are being voiced about the deal. Possible scenarios following the meaningful vote and the very likely defeat of the government with its withdrawal agreement. What's going to happen next? And then some key areas for the digital business, for data processing businesses, about the impact of a hard Brexit, i.e. no deal at all, crash out on the 29th of March and there isn't any agreement. So to start then with the timeline, the meaningful vote, of course, is today. I put the 18th of January as the date when the UK government had to report back. This is one of the 27 defeats that Mrs May's government has suffered since she took over in 2017. Basically, one of her options was just to have, if the withdrawal agreement was defeated, just to sit back and wait and let MPs sweat because there is no majority in the House of Commons for a hard exit. And just let them wait and realise there is no alternative to the withdrawal agreement other than a hard exit, and then finally they would have to approve it. And that possibility was stopped last week by a former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, who put forward an amendment basically saying that the government had to come back within 3 days of a defeat in relation to the withdrawal agreement with an alternative proposal. Now, I think it's probably 3 sitting days, which means that that probably isn't the 18th of January and it's probably the 21st of January. I couldn't establish when I did this timeline on Friday whether it was sitting days or not, but I think it is sitting days. So probably by the 21st of January, having had what could be a really historic defeat, the government's got to come back with a new plan. And the question is, will Mrs May come back with that plan, or if she suffers a really major defeat, will she resign? And if she comes back with another plan, what could the plan possibly be? Because the other conundrum is that it is very difficult to discern a majority in the House of Commons for anything other than that there would appear to be a majority against the deal, and there would appear to be a majority against a hard exit. So there's real difficulty in establishing what kind of agreement could command a majority. So the rest of my timeline is the sort of what I would describe as the traditional timeline, which suggests that we leave on the 29th of March. And if the withdrawal agreement or an equivalent is approved, there would be a transitional period ending on the 31st of December 2020. But if you are asking for my view, I think they will have to apply for an extension of the Article 50 notice, and that has to have the agreement of the other 27 member states. My understanding is that that agreement might be forthcoming for an extension to July of this year, but we have also had this very important case that went right up to the Court of Justice, which said that the UK can unilaterally withdraw its notice. And because there is no majority for any particular deal in the House of Commons, I think it is looking much more likely that one of the options on which they may be able to agree is that there is a second referendum. So what's the problem with it? Well, the Irish backstop, I think most people understand about that. This is the very great difficulty of having a hard border politically between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And the solution found in the withdrawal agreement is that in the event that there is no free trade agreement concluded after the extension, any extension of the transitional period, which could take you to 2022 or something like that, still no trade agreement concluded. Perfectly possible that that's the case. Canada took 7 years to agree its free trade agreement. You need unanimity on the part of all the member states for a free trade agreement. Very difficult to get that, very slow, all of this. If nothing is concluded, then what happens? And the answer is that actually Northern Ireland would stay in a much closer relationship with the rest of the EU than the rest of the UK. And there are grave political objections to that on the part of the DUP, on whom Mrs May depends for any majority at all. Leaving the customs union, that's a big bugbear, not surprisingly. Many people think it's essential that there is effectively frictionless trade from the customs point of view, no tariffs, no customs formalities between the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union. That is a key objection on the part of the Labour Party. Ability to enter into free trade agreements. There's no doubt that the withdrawal agreement would postpone that. You could negotiate them, but you couldn't actually conclude them. Loss of sovereignty, that's all about being a rule taker, because if you are not in the EU, you do not have a seat at the table for regulation. That is true if you use the Norway model and you're a member of the EEA, you also don't have a seat at the table, but you do get access, full access to the single market, and you could ask also to be in a customs union. That's the sort of Norway plus option. With the withdrawal agreement, you don't get access to the single market. You've got to negotiate that, and that's what's in the political declaration. Goodness knows how long that would take, and that's where the backstop issue comes up. And in the meantime, while you're in the transitional period and everything continues as it is, which is what business desperately wants, you are a rule taker. And finally, I think a few members of Parliament have worked out that that would be the situation. You'd be a rule taker, you'd be paying 39 billion in terms of the settlement. You still don't know you're going to get a trade agreement, you don't know when you're going to get it, and you've still got to face the possibility that the backstop would actually be implemented. And then, you know, what did the UK vote for when it voted by a very small majority to leave? What did it vote for? What Brexit did it vote for? And the answer is no one can actually say, because that was not on the ballot paper. And therefore, there are groups in Parliament who believe passionately, genuinely, that they think they know what the majority voted for in relation to Brexit, and they don't think that the withdrawal agreement is it. So, you know, this is a very complex situation where there is no obvious majority for any particular view. And this is a little slide which explains Mrs May's voting dilemma. Without the DUP, she has no majority. The Labour Party have set out 6 tests for Brexit. No chance of those being met by anything that looks like the withdrawal agreement. And basically those would mean full access to the single market, membership of a customs union, no diminution of workers' rights or environmental rights. The Liberal Democrats will never vote in favour of anything that relates to exit. They want a second referendum. The Scottish National Party are in the same place. The Democratic Unionist Party, that's the Northern Irish contingent, and they will never vote in favour of the withdrawal agreement as it presently exists because they believe it pushes them into the arms of the Republic of Ireland. Oh, it's quite hard, isn't it? Right, possible scenarios following the meaningful vote. Right, well, Mrs May has said we're going to be in uncharted territory. Well, we are going to be in uncharted territory. And she hoped, I think, that this exchange of letters with the Union, the EU, would move her ability to get a majority, or at least not as bad a defeat, forward. But in fact, when you read the exchange of letters, they say things like, well, we'll start negotiating the trade deal immediately. The backstop's only going to be temporary. It's suboptimal. Basically, we don't want to have to use the backstop. We don't like the backstop. We don't think that we're extending regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the EU if the backstop comes into force beyond what is strictly necessary, etc., etc. But the response, the political response to this exchange of letters has been negative, and people say there is still no legal protection against the backstop being implemented, and then we would be basically, as the UK, attached to the Union without any ability to control legislation, any ability to conclude any meaningful trade deals, and still have no trade deal. Right, I did a slide on the basis that the deal could potentially be approved and what that would mean. I don't actually think that at the moment this is likely to happen, but anyway, for what it's worth, 39 billion is handed over because Mrs May, and indeed I think this secures unanimity across the UK political establishment, the belief that the Union relied on UK budgetary contributions. It is not right just to leave the other members of the Union bearing those contributions, and that is included in the 39 billion. But also it is posited on the principle that there would be a trade deal. We would no longer be represented, and therefore during the transitional period we don't have a say as to how or what the laws are that are passed, and the Court of Justice of the European Union remains the ultimate arbiter. But we would stay in the single market and the customs union, and of course this gives businesses particularly time to adjust, because actually the prospect of some form of harder exit remains on the table with the withdrawal agreement. In other words, Christmas is coming, but it's not coming on the 29th of March. Instead, it's coming on the 31st of December 2020, or however long out the transitional period is extended. But every business does need to accept that they have to have a plan B, which is that actually there will be restrictions for UK businesses and indeed service providers in accessing the EU as a market post-Brexit, whenever that finally happens. If the deal is rejected, within 3 sitting days, the government's got to come back and say what they're going to do with the negotiations. And it's possible that at this point there could be a renegotiation, which does result in a, quotes, better, unquotes, deal. But I read this morning in, I think it was the Telegraph, that there's been a threat made by various cabinet members that if the UK edges 1 inch closer to Brussels, that these members will resign. And that really will make it very difficult for Mrs May, I think, to continue in office. And indeed, it's difficult to see how she could continue with yet more resignations. She's already had 12 resignations. A general election, that's what the Labour Party desperately want. I find that hard to see why they would want it so much when it looks as though at the moment the Conservative Party have a lead, quite a clear lead actually, in the polls of about 7%. But anyway, that's really what they're after. But that would require a no confidence vote in the government, because we have something called the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which says that the term for every parliament is 5 years. And if you are going to hold a general election within that 5-year period, you have to have a 2/3 majority for a no confidence vote. And I do not think that they will get that, because the Conservative MPs will not vote for that. A second referendum would need new legislation. some people believe that that legislation could be introduced quite quickly, such that if you extended the Article 50 notice, say, to July, that there would be time to pass the legislation necessary for a new referendum. But I think anybody can see there's got to be a question about what questions would be posed on this second referendum, assuming you could get a majority for that. What questions would you ask? Would you ask, do you want to stay in rather than have the withdrawal agreement? Or would you ask whether you could live with a hard Brexit? I mean, how to formulate those questions, that would take, I think, days of debate, quite frankly. And I do not know, I don't think anyone could know how the majorities might turn out on those debates. The other thing that people are talking about is sort of Norway for now, or Norway plus, because the Labour Party really want the UK to stay in the customs union because they believe that's important for the economy. Whether you could have an arrangement whereby the UK stayed in the EEA the way Norway is in the EEA, but Norway is not actually in the customs union, and you would add on membership of the customs union, and this would give access to the single market, membership of the customs union. You'd get frictionless trade at that point. But again, it's not clear that there is a majority in favour of that. And then lastly, there's leave with no deal, against which there is no majority in favour of leave with no deal. So one thing that people have suggested is to have some sort of trial votes. And this was done when the question of reforming the House of Lords was being discussed in Parliament. And this means that basically you put forward various resolutions to the House of Commons and you see which ones you can pass. Right, okay. Now, what are your key issues? Because I think I've only got about 3 minutes or something like that. I can't find the chairman, but okay, time up. Right, that's not good. All right, I'll go quickly. So what happens if there's no deal? And I mean, from this, this is a really sort of short shopping list of things that people need to think, they must think about. Even the smallest businesses must think about these things. First of all, freedom to provide services across the EU for UK nationals comes to an end. And that's more important than you might think. But it basically means that at the moment there is non-discrimination on the grounds of nationality, and also we're part of the single market. So any UK national can go wherever they want. And indeed, any UK business can provide its services or establish itself wherever it wants, right across the EEA, and that will come to an end. And in relation to individuals, it will be a question of basically WTO rules, which is the General Agreement on Trade in Services, and that means that you have to look at local laws as to what is permitted. Lawyers are certainly affected by this. Any other individual professionals will be affected by this. Any services business will be affected by this. So you need to think about where you are established and where you need to provide services, and what the impact of local laws about the ability to discriminate on grounds of nationality could mean for your ability to continue trading the way you are now. In other words, it's a structural question, how you set yourself up, making sure that you have got the right vehicles and the right individuals, if you like, providing services in the rest of the EEA. The free movement of workers provisions will end, but quite frankly, that's not going to matter. The union produced 14 measures in December to deal with a hard Brexit, and Mrs May has also made various statements about what will happen on a hard Brexit, and that is not going to affect the rights of people who live and work now, are UK nationals living and working in the EU, or are EU nationals living and working in the UK. Their existing rights will not be affected. And there will be reciprocal release from visas for short stays. There will be a UK immigration system under which EU citizens will not get preferential treatment, and the focus will be on attracting highly skilled workers, by which they mean people who earn a salary of at least $30,000 a year, which isn't going to help the health service. Right, this bit is important. Trademarks and registered designs. Existing rights will be automatically protected where they are protected by EU trademarks or the EU registered community design by operation of law on the exit date. And the exit date is at the moment the 29th of March 2018. If the notice is extended, that will move out, and it will be whatever is the date to which it moves out. And there's a 9-month grace period for applications and allows you to refile your UK rights. But you will need to think about renewals in the future because the rights will be separated across the EU and the UK. And then lastly, copyright, actually one of the areas which is least affected, I would say, by a hard Brexit, because the relevant law is contained in international treaties. Data protection, on the other hand, what a nightmare. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, really, really hard. I am not a data protection specialist, and my partner, who's answering these queries constantly, had to spend quite a long time explaining to me what would happen. But basically, the problem seems to be this. The UK will be a third country, and you need to identify your data flows between the EU and the UK. The UK Data Protection Commissioner, Information Commissioner, will recognise EU rules as adequate. There is nothing in those 14 measures that I described to you that says that the EU will recognise UK rules as adequate. And there are various things that it may be possible to do to deal with that. You might have to have an EEA-based supervisory authority as your lead supervisory authority. You might need a representative in the EU who is recognised by the Data Protection Authority. You certainly want some model data protection clauses in your contracts. There are various things that you can consider. I'm not the best person to ask about them all in detail, but I can get you some answers if you want them. And on that note, I'm going to stop.
Well, thank you very much, Ross Calloway. Well, sorry you took much more time, so there's no time for questions, but are you around for one-on-one questions?
Yeah, by all means. Yes.
Okay, she'll be here.
Very happy.
Thank you very much. There you go. Okay, so the next speaker is already there. Automation and artificial intelligence to improve data center operations. Tobias Pulker, welcome on stage. You are the Global Marketing Manager of Siemens Building Technologies.
Correct.
Please take it away.
Thank you for the welcome and sorry.
This is your phone, right?
Good. Yeah, welcome to the presentation of integration of automation and artificial intelligence in data center operations. First of all, I'd like to ask you questions. How many of you think that human error is one of the main reasons for data center outages? Just raise the hand. Quite some convinced, yeah, and that is right. Poneman's study from 2016 showed that it's the second largest reason for data center outages after UPS failures. And to go on with some more figures, you might think, okay, maybe data center outages are not that regularly, but it shows that over the last 3 years, almost every third data center was affected by one of these outages. And to show how much effect this means on the balance sheet, I have another statistics which shows that it's an average $9,000 per minute what it costs to have an outage. And in some cases, it reaches even more than 50,000 dollars per minute. So it has a heavy impact when people try to manage complex issues in a data center and suddenly big problems occur by trying to find a workaround. So it's one of the main reasons. And the question is how to tackle this. Automation and artificial intelligence seem to be one of the main levers to address this. Whereas having a look on the very complex environment as a data center you have to deal with, it's not only within the data center that you have a very complex environment, it's even the boundary condition you're dealing with. So competition and different tenants, different SLAs for co-location centers, for instance. And the speed of change, which is constantly driving this complexity. To find an answer to this, you have this typical trends in the market we can observe with everything as a service to outsource responsibilities to mitigate risks IoT and analytics can be an answer to manage the complexity. But at the same time, trust is a very important factor, so cybersecurity is one of the key elements to keep the path. So to handle this on a digital layer, it's not anymore sufficient that you have just the products that manage your infrastructure, like air handling units, so the mechanical elements. They need to have a certain smartness. They need to be able to manage on a higher level. And this was an evolvement from just single products to systems to system of systems. So managing the overall data center is now a very complex and integrated environment now from different systems, and you need to have an answer to manage these systems, like with a DCIM we know. From Siemens, we have developed an integrated data center management suite, which addresses this management level on a software layer. Besides the hardware we have with regard to HVAC, with regard to fire safety, with regard to security. The question now is, what does it mean in practice? And for this, I've brought an example, a case study that we have made in the United States. It's a 4,000 square meter data center, and it's about cooling optimization. So another question for you: how many of you think that handling the airflow and the cooling management in the data center is an easy thing for people to do? No one is convinced of this. And it shows what we have seen in the past, seeing so many sessions about cooling optimization. The complexity is quite high, but nonetheless, I'm convinced that it's not that difficult to manage the cooling optimization. And for this, I've brought this case study we will see in a few seconds. First of all, to introduce the cooling topic, let's have a look on how the cooling is designed. So basically, you have to take into account the maximum IT load at the warmest day in the year with a buffer in case of unforeseen issues. So that is a basic cooling capacity you have in the data center. And the question is now how to handle this huge capability in terms of the IT load you have actually in your data center. And having these many air handling units create a certain complexity. This different server racks you have and the changing environment in your data center, all that managing manually is a thing that cannot be, where you will never reach the target. So there will be always wasted energy, and with regard to the server capacity you have, you will never reach the real limit that you could put in your data center. So also on the income side of your balance sheet, you are limited. And nonetheless, still there are sometimes hotspots. So you have three main issues: that you waste energy, that you secondly do not reach the capacity you could have, and still have hotspots. What we see here now is a floor map of a data center. And this is not just a heat map, it's an influencing map we see. And having these blue and red spots show the deviation of temperature that is created by these air handling units you see in the green spot at the bottom. And the deviation of the temperature is shown in the scale you see at the bottom in Fahrenheit. So it's a 4,000 square meter data center with a raised floor in the US. And it shows now the air handling unit with this, the circle with a triangle in there, and the little triangles you see scattered around this floor map. These are the sensors that measure the temperature. And now you see these influence maps, which shows basically having this air handling unit switched off, and what happens if we switch it on. And the interesting thing is that even if I switch on this air handling unit, which should cool down the data center, we have a hotspot a bit higher, which shows that it's not just about cooling, it also affects other air handling units, which might increase at certain points the temperature. And how should you do this manually? Let's go to another air handling unit. Okay, the green circle is a bit too high, it's somehow shifted. Nonetheless, you see which air handling unit I'm referring to. You see that the influence here from this air handling unit is not so big, only a very small influence. This here, I think I have a pointer. Now substituting this, so it's about this air handling unit. You see that it has almost no effect. The question is it broken? Or is it just, does it just have no effect? So the point could be check it and look if it's broken. But at least it shows the influencing map specifically for this air handling unit. And here we have one, using again the pointer, that has a large effect on the whole data center. And why do I show you now these different influencing maps? It's kind of library. So having for each of these air handling units the information, how much does it affect the cooling of my data center, allows the artificial intelligence to overlay the different influencing factors of the air handling units and then to optimize the cooling of the data center. It's like with a mathematical spline that you can use and create by different curves and overlay them to the final curve you would like to show. The same here for the data center cooling. And with this one, you can reach, on the one hand, a reduction of cost for cooling your data center. At the same time, you can increase the capacity of the data center because suddenly you have more potential to cool down what the racks and the heat generating server racks, and you can avoid hotspots. So the risk of outages is reduced. Having seen now this tangible example of how artificial intelligence can be used in operations, and this can be done also for other aspects like predictive maintenance, where you evaluate what kind of effect or what are the failure patterns and how to predict the requirement for maintenance. It shows that connecting the dots, so the information that is available, can really bring you to another level in terms of competitiveness, in terms of satisfying the needs of your customers, and in terms of efficiency. So also another topic will be forecasting of capacity, for instance. That is the third point you see here. So if you see certain patterns, how, for instance, co-location centers, data centers, that have a regular change of tenants, they can also use, for instance, with a DCIM solution that we have, the forecasting for the capacity based on the patterns that have been observed in the past. And so you can harvest all that potential on the revenue side and on the cost side. Nonetheless, everything comes at a certain price. It requires also that in your operations certain tools are implemented, and also not only the tools, also the processes are adapted to it. Otherwise you cannot leverage the full potential. So digitalization is not only buying a tool, installing it, and that's it. It's also adapting the processes. And beside the processes, you also need to have a long-term view, which means there needs to be a certain strategy to do the right things at the right time. And last but not least, it's also about your partners, your network. So it's basically a joint effort that needs to be done. So you need partners that are aware and capable of doing this and supporting you on the path to digitalize your business and your processes, to keep your competitiveness, or even to increase your competitive, to gain an advantage and stay successful. So, I don't know what about the time. I think.
Well, you're right on time, so let's take one question if people have questions, that is, of course. Yeah, there's a question over there. Bakir, could you get the microphone to the gentleman over there?
How much time does it take to learn the algorithm?
That's a very good question. Thank you for this one. So if you have this cooling optimization solution, it takes about 1 day to 1 week to give the system the opportunity to learn and to set this library of information, and then you run it parallel to your operations to confirm that it's a robust and valid system. And let's say after 1 month, you can really put the operations to this automated system called white space cooling optimization.
Yeah, sufficient answer? Okay, thank you very much. Tobias Spilker.
Thank you well.
So, now ladies and gentlemen, something completely different, because my next two guests are going to interview each other. And there they already are, Raymond Stanford and Lechen. You can take one of these chairs, you can also stand up, you can dance, what you like.
Let's stand up.
Yeah, okay. So Raymond Stanford over here, he's the liaison at ICT Room, and Lechen is president at Rovisys. Can I bluntly say that ICT Room represents the edge side of the market, while you represent the hyperscaling side of the market?
Oh, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, okay. Well, perhaps you can kick off with the differences between your two companies, so
Correct.
people can grasp it. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you. You want to take a stab, Craig?
Yeah, I guess maybe a disclaimer for everybody. We have no PowerPoint, no presentation, and really no rehearsal either. So just 2 men and microphones.
When we get stuck, he has a lot of jokes to tell you and to lighten the.
And I can
the pace
dance
up.
too.
Oh, you can dance, do you?
So maybe a first introduction. Maybe tell me a little bit about ICT.
Right.
What you
So we might be a little bit familiar because of our name, but we are coming from a design and building data centers all across the globe. Prefabricated modular data centers, and just not the hyperscalers. So Craig will enlighten us why that's a different story. But we also see a shift into the edge market, so that's why we thought this was very nice to do and to show you some of the, let's say, ends of different markets and see what is the resemblance and potentially what are the big differences. So
right. So Craig with Rovisys, we're a specialty contractor. We do systems integration, deploy building management and power monitoring systems from a number of manufacturers. I'm not a data center operator, but we have helped deploy nearly 2,000 megawatts of data floor in the last several years. So while I'm not by any means an expert, we've seen a few things.
Correct. I think the models that we see is that Craig is really into the hyperscale, which is a very centralized model of building your data center. So in between, there's a decentralized. So where we see is a big colo space, and in the edge, you are talking about a distributed model. So what we are currently facing is, and we saw a few presentations already about redundancy and the technology about that. We think that everybody knows that the edge is coming, everybody's talking about that, but how do you actually roll with that? From our standpoint, designing and building data centers, this is almost like a dumb down of the technology because we're working in a distributed or even a mesh network. So if one node, as we call it, fails, it doesn't really matter that much. So we had people asking us, can you fix that in 2 days? Well, sure we can. We're coming from a different world with minutes when a data center
That
is
is
down.
completely bizarre from my side of things because on the hyperscale, everything is about redundancy and uptime. when we're dealing with 30 megawatt data halls, it can't shut down.
Correct.
And what's interesting about our customer base is I don't think they're here. They largely do things on their own. So, all the best practices, all of the off-the-shelf technologies and solutions that are being, discussed and marketed currently, they're picking and choosing from among them, but then really putting a lot of design effort into their own builds, their own structures, because they view that as a competitive advantage, which sounds like it's a very different strategy from a more product centralized edge system.
Well, yeah, true. But we also see that typically a data center should be able to run any customer that you want to bring in. And looking at the hyperscale, there's also a resemblance now that the software that they design to run on the data center is also in the edge market. So we are dumbing down, and we are trying to make the infrastructure run just a particular function. And this is the resemblance within the hyperscaling, that we have to change our way of thinking as well. So this is not a multi-tenant technology that we try to roll with. So how you roll with it is also different, because this is typically investor-driven. You're rolling out 100 or 200 micro data centers across the globe. How do you control that?
How do you support it?
Well, how do you support it? Don't forget the human factor here, that you're not able to maintain 100 or several hundreds of nodes with a maintenance team. So you see a lot of things changing, which is also driven down from the hyperscale market. So there's a big resemblance in how they address to get the data or the throughput eventually into the hyperscale. So we meet in the middle, because eventually the data needs to go somewhere. But on these nodes, it's just throughput and connection. So the technology is typically changing, but also the people maintaining it. You would be able to dispatch a field engineer, which might be somebody from a delivery company like DHL, right? He has some virtual reality goggles, and he knows what to do to change a filter. So that way of thinking is entirely different than building a data center for a multi-tenant. And that's derived from what the hyperscaler has been doing, designing the data center for the software they need to run.
Yeah, if the DHL person wants to get into one of our data centers, they need retinal scans, not goggles, because a lot of the hyperscale sites. I mean, we're not talking about one building. We're talking about sites that can have nearly 1,000 megawatts in one campus. They almost function like in a large industrial plant.
Correct.
So there's a lot of in-house engineering and a lot of in-house operations capability. I know from our standpoint at Rovasys, it's really changed or evolved our thinking to being focused on service, because a lot of times we're following our end customer's lead as opposed to trying to solve an industry-wide problem and then package it up so that multiple people can buy it. It'd be interesting afterwards to talk about how those two strategies overlap on the different extremes, because I think there may be opportunities for us to help with some of the, let's say, customization and upfront design on the edge side of it. But there's a lot that I think could be brought to the hyperscalers in terms of turnkey operation and support models.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we discussed before that we somewhere meet in the middle. I mean, when we look at the dispatching of 5G, and somewhere it had to hit the ground, and then something happens, something has to be done with that data or with that connection. The one thing that we think that is really a similarity or an overlap is how they maintain hyperscalers on the software level. So we're generally believing that the guys who have that software in hand would be able to actually enter the edge market quite easy. Besides the infrastructure, because that's something that they typically don't know how to do. This is for us a dumb down, so this is where we meet. But the software running that and how to maintain it and making sure that everything's running, that's going to be a crucial factor. And I know that the hyperscalers, they start with software and then start designing a data center. So that is an overlap.
Yeah, and it really is a difference in philosophy, because what we've experienced working with a number of clients is that we'll start with packages or solutions from manufacturers that are available on the market, but the first question is, okay, that looks neat. Now, can I take it apart? Because I want to change it, or I want to take this piece of it, I want to adapt it. Again, The intent being to come up with a competitive advantage because they're really looking for that efficiency of scale that comes with the size.
Well, correct. And we see the same thing in the edge market, that the typical servers or the typical equipment is changing as well. Like the hyperscalers, they, a motherboard or a CPU node is something completely different in a hyperscale. They even make it themselves and then, source it somewhere. That's what's happening in the micro data centers as well. I mean, the telcos will have specific equipment, but also the compute power is entirely different. It might be a single card with a lot of CPUs on it. So how do you actually maintain that? And if it fails, another node takes over. So it's a general way of changing your whole way of thinking.
So Raymond, how do you see intellectual property and intellectual property ownership and rights evolving as the edge develops? Because what it looks like is you have a lot of devices that will be scattered around, talking to a lot of other devices. There has to be some type of integration or interoperability there. Who owns it?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that in the hyperscale that works the same way, that they keep their intellectual property to themselves because they designed it. I think it's a mutual approach that the infrastructure supporting that edge market, that is not a real intellectual property, but how to maintain it and how to run it, that's going to be the missing link. And we saw that a lot of people have the infrastructure, and there's people building containers and what have you, but how to do that and approach that market, that is something that nobody really come around to yet. The one guys, well, likely to be us. Well, is that bragging? No. Who have that fixed, they can really roll out capacity in a distributed model, like you said. The intellectual property would be more in the lines of the IT side in that sense, because what we are doing is maybe building tier 2 or tier 1 modules, right? So that is not sophisticated technology. The way to roll it with it, so the logistics and stuff, that is a crucial part of what we're doing. I would say that the IT side of things and the connection side of things would be the intellectual property owner.
Fair enough. Any questions for the audience? I think we have some extra microphones.
Did we get it? Yeah, okay.
Oh, perfect. Did we